Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. So as we wait to go live in the Ashley MacArthur courtroom, we want to focus on something very different, something we haven't talked about here on Law and Crime. Have you ever heard the expression, there's no escaping the law? Well, what happens if you commit a crime in outer space? Yep, that's right. We're talking space crimes. There's an incredible story happening right now. I don't know if you've heard about it. A woman named Summer Warden, she's accusing her estranged wife, NASA astronaut Anne McClain, and many of you have probably heard of her, of committing identity theft and financial fraud by accessing her bank account without permission. But she didn't allegedly do this in her office or her home. No, she allegedly did this while she was aboard the International Space Station. Warden claims that this was all a plot by McClain to try to get custody of Warden's young son because they're in a bitter separation and custody dispute. McClain has returned to Earth and she has denied the allegations. In fact, she tweeted out a response that I want to read out to you right now if we have it. So again, she wrote, "There's unequivocally no truth to these claims. We've been going through a painful personal separation that's now unfortunately in the media. I appreciate the outpouring of support and will reserve comment until after the investigation. I have total confidence in the IG process." But obviously there are so many questions in terms of what could happen and what this means. So we're going to break down some space law right now. John, let's start with you. Okay, first question is, if a crime is committed on the International Space Station, who has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute this?
Hold on, let me put on my space helmet for this one.
If you had one, it would just be amazing.
I was looking around the room for props during the break, and I couldn't find anything. So we've litigated airplane crash cases and a case involving a wrongful death at Gitmo. And believe it or not, Gitmo, everybody thinks it's the United States, but we lease it from Cuba, but it's a hostile lease. So the property's not Cuba's, it's not the United States. This is the closest rock that I can find that's equivalent to the space station. So the courts, obviously there's not an international court on Mars, right? And so you've got to find sufficient contacts, and the fraud actually happened in Kansas. So we suspect the federal court in Kansas or state courts of Kansas would take over here. But we are getting into that brave new world of what happens when things happen in outer space, and how do you find a justice, a home for justice on Earth?
One answer: Space Force. That's the answer. Now, Melba, how do you even investigate this? I mean, if something takes place in outer space, and we're talking about allegedly a financial crime here, it's through the internet, but let's say somebody commits a murder in space, so there's some physical crime that happens, an assault of some kind. How do you actually investigate that? And I'm thinking about it in two ways. One, is there the possibility, and I'm not trying to be outrageous here, but couldn't someone just stay up there? I mean, how do you even get someone to come back to Earth if you want to actually seek justice? But number two, aren't there difficulties in actually processing a scene like that if it takes place in outer space?
Ooh, yeah, Jesse, absolutely. This is definitely a brave new world, as John mentioned before. This is something that I believe would fall in the jurisdiction of the FBI for investigation. Because again, the federal government gets involved when there's crimes that crosses state lines or somehow affects what we would call interstate commerce. So using a bank and making transfers, the money, basically goes through a process, and that is something that would cross state lines. So this would be a type of case that the FBI would be investigating, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office in whatever district, whether it be, if it's in Kansas where the victim is located, they would probably be the ones to handle the case. But to your example of a homicide in outer space, again, what would have to happen is the crime scene would have to be preserved. So eventually the ship or whatever would have to come back to Earth, or the FBI would have to go up with astronauts and look at the space station and try to collect evidence that way. I mean, there's a ton of problems with being able to, get there in a timely manner, be able to talk to the witnesses in a timely manner, to be able to photograph and document the crime scene. So all of that is definitely an uphill battle, but I would not call an International Space Station definition, the perfect crime scene, because again, everything you do leaves a digital footprint. There may be surveillance cameras. I would think there would be surveillance cameras in the majority of the space station, so that footage would be able to be used against any potential defendant at trial.
It sounds like a Tom Hanks movie just waiting to happen, just waiting to happen. And maybe that, who knows, entertainment kind of matches what happens in real life here. But I guess, John, what about other countries? This is the International Space Station. Don't they have a say in what's happening here? And maybe if there was the victim was not from the United States, would that be a different situation as well? I mean, it's the International Space Station. And when we talk about space, I mean, who has the rights to space? That's the different question, too. So I'm curious, do other countries have a say in maybe what happened here or other crimes?
There are some kind of founding documentation behind the International Space Station. So it's not like this lawless place. There's rules. But yeah, I mean, if you had there's not a country that I could imagine where murder isn't illegal. Or fraud isn't illegal. And in here, you've got an American defrauding, arguably or allegedly, another American. So we don't have to venture out that far. I just keep thinking about your example and all the frequent flyer miles that Melba and I would get, though, trying to get our client.
And I guess the question really is, Melba, like if you're on the International Space Station and you're thinking, and again, she is denying all these allegations, and I'm just creating a hypothetical here. But let's say there was a loophole in one country's law that's not a loophole in the United States, and a way of what's considered a financial crime or what you have to prove to have a financial crime. Maybe it's easier to prove in the United States, but much more difficult to prove in another country. Couldn't a lawyer, a space lawyer, yep, I said it, a space lawyer, couldn't they kind of take advantage of those different laws and say, well, it happened on this part of the International Space Station, this country has jurisdiction to that, and this is something we have to consider?
Any of those things are possible, but I think what it boils down to is that since all of these countries are using the space station cooperatively, I think it's in their best interest to kind of work out that situation among themselves. So let's say it was the United States and it was, and again, just hypothetically, a Norwegian national that ended up losing their life. The two countries would have to diplomatically figure out who should handle the investigation and where the person should be tried. Let's say if it's a Norwegian national that was harmed, then Norway may want to try the case on their shores. So, again, the countries would have to figure out sort of like what we saw with Julian Assange. And, folks were saying, OK, Sweden wanted to try him, but he was hiding out in somebody else's embassy. And it became, there had to be discussion because the Brits wanted him. The British government wanted him as well. So they all had to decide, OK, who's going to try him first? Whose statute of limitations runs first? Who has the most severe crime? And they worked it out that way. So I think the diplomatic route would resolve where the case would be tried, as well as who would handle the investigation. And additionally, I'm sure in the founding documents of the International Space Station, there's some discussion if something happens on the ship. I'm sure they had some great attorneys on representing each of the governments, figuring out, okay, if there was a problem on the ship, who would have jurisdiction and how it would be resolved.
I'm not going to lie to you. Now that we had this conversation, I'm thinking maybe a Space Force does make sense. You have an entity out there that could just come up, and John's ready for that role.
Can I go ahead and start commercial for John Phillips Space Force Law, please?
So next time we see you, John, you're just going to be reporting from a space station. It's going to have a really choppy feed, and it's going to be great. It's going to be great. Law and Crime, it's the Outer Space Edition. It's perfect. It's what we're looking to do. Well, thank you both for that. It's an interesting story. We haven't had a chance to talk about it. And who knows, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we're probably going to be hearing more about space law and space-related crimes and issues. Well, hopefully not, but you never know. In the meantime, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be back here on Earth talking about the trial in Florida. Stay tuned.